So here I am melting everything down, and you'll notice that the stripes towards the top and the stripes towards the bottom are very close together, and there's not a lot of separation between the stripes, and you're not seeing a lot of that underlying layer color of that medium gray transparent between them. So what I do is I take my tungsten pick and I go between each of the stripes on the layer underneath, and I pull that color down a little further. So just in case any of those final stripes have melted together or they're a little too close together and you don't see any of that color in between, I am creating or elongating that amount of usable glass and that separation by pulling that center color down towards the mandrel in between each stripe in this step. And you can see a little bit of that here as I turn the gather. Now I want to do the very same thing on top. Some of those stripes have overlapped and they're creating more of a solid blue color. I want to elongate the amount of usable glass I have available to me in the final pull. So I'm going in between each of these stripes, pulling on that medium gray transparent color in between towards the top of this gather. And that is extending the amount of usable glass I will have in the final pull. Now there's a lot of waste glass at the top here, so I am going to pick it off with my tungsten tweezers. That also helps extend those stripes and the separation between the stripes even further. I'm giving some more heat to the bottom of the gather, again using my magic wand tool to scrape that glass down towards the mandrel to make sure everything is stuck down secure, because the next step is going to be melting everything down and pulling. It's time to attach the second mandrel to my gather. So I'm heating the top of it in the flame. I want it nice and warm so it sticks to the top of my gather. And I'm getting the top of the gather nice and soft and melty so that this mandrel can plunge into the center of it and attach itself very securely. Once the top of the gather is nice and soft and the top of my mandrel is nice and hot, I'm going to join them together. I push the mandrel into the top of the glass and rock it back and forth and side to side to make sure that glass is well adhered to the mandrel. Now each mandrel acts as a handle. So I have two mandrels on either side, and I have my gather of glass in the middle with a mandrel sticking out of both the top and the bottom of that gather. The goal now is to heat everything through to the core of my gather. So I'm angling everything 45 degrees to the torch. So I'm tilting everything up and applying the heat of the torch to the bottom of my gather. Again, heating up those joins where the glass is meeting the metal mandrel to make sure nothing pops off. Then I tilt everything the other way so that my left hand is up and my right hand is down, and aiming the heat at the shoulder of the gather. As I apply the heat to the ends of the gather, the heat is traveling towards the center of the gather and softening the core inside. You do have to be careful, however, that you don't apply so much heat to where the glass joins your metal mandrel that the mandrel slips out and you lose your grip. Of course, you can reattach it at this stage. Everything's going to stay put and you'll be fine, but just keep an eye on that. Right now, you're just focused on heating those sides, tilting it up, giving heat to the bottom, tilting it back the other way, heating the other side, which was the top of your gather. So back and forth, encouraging that heat to soak into the center of the gather from the ends. We will focus the heat on the belly of the gather very soon, but right now we are just encouraging a lot of heat inside the gather that soaks up into the core. And actually, the metal mandrels help that happen. The heat will travel up through the metal into the inside of the gather and help that soften. Now we're applying heat to the belly. We've got a lot of good heat on either end, and that heat is still being retained inside the gather. But now we're going to soften up those outer layers of the middle of the gather. You can see now that the gather is still a tight ball, and what we're doing is applying enough heat so that the gather starts softening and relaxing on its own. And you will see that happen right before your eyes. As the gather absorbs and soaks up enough heat, it will not only soften and melt, but it will also relax into this more football-like shape when it has absorbed enough heat. So just keep going back and forth. Tilt everything up one way, apply the heat to the bottom. Tilt everything back the other way, apply the heat to that side, and just keep up this routine going back and forth and center, back and forth and center, over and over, slowly turning it and watching the shape. You can watch the glow too. The glow is a good indicator, the color of the glow, as to how much heat it's holding. Especially if you pick it up out of the flame, you'll see how it's retaining heat either on the sides or in the core or all evenly across. And that's what you want, all evenly across. So here I'm giving a lot of heat to the belly, and then I'm flashing the left and the right sides where the mandrels are attached just to keep them warm. I don't want them to cool off too quickly either, otherwise they will break off instead of pull out. There's just that fine line of warmth versus too cool or versus too hot, and you just get that with experience and practice, knowing the feel of it and also the look of it. Now here you can see my gather is starting to relax, especially on the right side. I gave it a lot of heat, and so I can see that that right side is relaxing and stretching out a little bit. Now something else you can do to test how soft the glass is before you are getting ready to pull is to push in on both of your mandrels. Test the flexibility of the glass. Is it just moving on the ends where the mandrels are, or is the center flexing in and out when you push? I also notice when I'm tilting my gather one way that the glass is sinking with gravity on that side, and when I tilt it the other way, it's sinking to that side with gravity. So I know I am getting a lot of heat to the core, and I'm getting very, very close to the pull. When I start getting really close to pulling, I change my focus from soaking it with heat on either end to soaking it with heat in the center, because that's where the most movement is going to happen. But I can see that the glass is flexing all the way to the center of the gather, so I know I am very, very close to being able to pull this down to cane. I still have to remember to flash the sides, flash the ends, keep them warm, because they will get really cold much quicker than the center since they are smaller, they are thinner, and there's not as much glass there. So naturally they will get cooled off very quickly. So I am mindful of keeping them warm. If ever you do overheat your ends and you notice that your mandrel is at risk of being pulled out, then just remove that end from the flame and let it cool down for a few moments on its own so that it's nice and stiff again. You can clearly see at this point that the gather is no longer that really tight ball. It is definitely more relaxed. I also want to mention that you don't want it to get soupy. You don't want your gather to get so loose and so molten that when you pull, it pulls so thin. You really want to focus when you're pulling on keeping your cane at about that 4 to 6 to 7 millimeter range. When I first started making cane, I used to have one of my regular size rods in front of me as a guide. That was my size that I was aiming for with the diameter of my cane. So you want to make sure that you don't overheat your gather so that it's so soft, because if it's so soft it will be very difficult to pull without you wanting to pull so fast that it gets really thin. When it's a little stiffer, you're going to have an easier time of getting that diameter around that 4 to 5 to 6 millimeter size. It will just be too difficult to pull it that much thinner. All right, we're really getting there now. Can you see the football shape? I have shown you the entire process of heating this gather enough to where it's ready to pull. You can see I'm flexing it there, testing to see if it's ready. It looks ready. I just want to make sure it is ready. All these different glasses have different viscosities. They're all the same COE, but some are stiffer than others, some melt quicker than others. So sometimes it takes a long time for the center of the gather to get heated enough that everything is ready to pull together. But we're very close. Right before I'm ready to pull, I rock the gather back and forth to get the heat all the way up and down the gather, which by then has relaxed into this little bit of elongated shape all on its own. Want to make sure everything is nice and evenly heated. I don't want any spots that are too cold. I don't want any spots that are too hot, because if it's not even heat, you will not get a nice even pull. A couple more seconds, and it's going to be time to pull. All right, here we go. Now you can see I'm pulling with both hands. Both hands are pulling at the same rate. The glass is stiff. That glass is really stiff, so I flash it a little bit into the flame to give it a little more heat, to loosen it up so I can pull it even longer. Once I've pulled it as far as I can, I cut off each end of the mandrels, which has a little bit of that waste glass left on it, and I reuse it to make twisties. I want to use as much of this cane as possible. I have spent a lot of time. I have used a lot of glass. I want to get the most bang for my buck out of my time here and all the materials I've used. So I am going to make twisties from the remainder waste glass that is on the ends of the mandrel. Now the glass that is hanging on to the ends of the mandrel are not going to be used for Murrini. The design gets too distorted at the mandrels because of all the layers and all the pushing and pulling throughout the process, but the outside of it looks great. That's why I love to make twisties from the waste glass that is still stuck to the two mandrels that came off the cane. But in this particular case, when I cut off the mandrel on the right side of my cane, my mandrel went flying across my workbench and onto the floor in the dusty corner. So I couldn't get to the mandrel because of where it was located at the time that I had this hot glass still stuck to my mandrel here, and I didn't have time to go put it down and get it because it was hot and I didn't want to have to reach down into a dark hole with a hot rod of glass down there. I had to leave it and let it cool off and get it later. But I still had a lot of glass on this mandrel and I didn't want it to go to waste. So I quickly introduced the glass remaining on this mandrel back into the flame. Luckily, I had gotten to this piece so fast that nothing shocked off. It was already retaining quite a lot of heat. So my first thought here was I will grab one of my rods of glass, attach it to the end of the waste glass here, and then use that as a tool to help make my twisty. Well, that didn't work out. So, plan B, I grabbed my tungsten tweezers and held on to that little end piece and then introduced the bulk of that waste glass into the flame so it was soft. And at the same time, I pulled and twisted the remainder of this glass into a very pretty twisty. Now this twisty will be a great accompaniment to any beads that I use these particular Murrini chips in. And I think it's a great way to use up as much glass as you can from all your efforts making this cane. Here you can see the final cane and the final twisty that I made. You can see on the left those beautiful stripes on top of that medium gray. Looks so pretty. And the twisty on the right is going to be great to use in beads that I use with those Murrini chips. Here is a photo of one of those Murrini chips from that cane that I used in one of my encased Murrini beads. And you can see how pretty it is. I love that look and I think it adds a lot of interest and a lot of detail to my bead.